Okay, so we'll get started now. I want to say welcome to everyone. My name is Julie Zuckerman, and I am the author of the Book of Jeremiah, which came out from Press 53 in 2019. And it gives me great pleasure today to welcome you to Bold Stories and Unexpected Connections, and to hear from Jolene and Shena about their new collections. And let me just say, before I introduce the authors, I loved reading these collections. They're so amazing, and it made me want to go out and buy copies for all of my friends who teach fiction, because there's so much to learn from these stories. So I was very excited about that. The format of today's session is that I'm going to introduce the authors and then ask them various questions. And I think you're all on mute right now, but please feel free to add questions to the chat, and then we'll leave time at the end to get to all the questions. And if you have any technical difficulties, just put them in a private note in the chat to me. Okay, so let me introduce Jolene McIlwain. Her work has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize and appears in numerous online and print journals, including Cincinnati Review, Craft, Smokebomb Quarterly, New Orleans Review, Litro Prime Number, which is Press 53's literary magazine, and many more. Her work was included in 2019's Best Small Fictions Anthology and named finalist for 2018's Best of the Net, Glimmer Trains, and River Styx contests, among others. She's taught literary theory and analysis at, okay, I'm not going to pronounce this properly correctly, Jolene?
Duquesne.
Okay, and Chatham University, and she worked as a radiologic technologist before attending college. She was born, raised, and currently lives in a small town in the Appalachian Plateau of Western Pennsylvania. SIDLE Creek, her debut collection, right here, received a star review from Publishers Weekly, and Shelf Awareness called it a rare gem, a compelling blend of nature and humanity, perfect for fans of Barbara Kingsolver's Prodigal Summer and Daisy Johnson's Death. So welcome, Jolene. And we go way back to an online writing group, and we met at the BCFA's postgraduate writers conference, all the way back in 2015. Shena McAuliffe is the author of The Good Echo, a novel by Black Lawrence Press, Last Light Electricity essays from the University of Alaska, and We Are Teeming Wilderness, which came out just now from Press 53 and was the winner of the 2022 Press 53 Award for Short Fiction. Her short stories and essays have been published in Conjunctions, Black Warrior Review, Alaska Quarterly Review, Copper Nickel, and elsewhere. She earned a PhD in literature and creative writing at the University of Utah and an MFA in fiction writing at Washington University in St. Louis. She grew up in Wisconsin and Colorado and now lives in Schenectady, New York, where she is John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Assistant Professor of English at Union College. So let me just go back to my thing for a second, make sure there's no other chats. Okay. I'm just going to start by asking each of you to introduce your book in about, a couple minutes each. And Shena, since you're unmuted, why don't you go first? And then we'll get to the questions after.
Thanks, Julie, so much for hosting us. It's really a pleasure to be here. And one of the delights of having a book come out is the connections that it provokes with other writers. So I'm really pleased to be meeting both of you through this event and meeting Jolene's work, which is amazing. So my story collection, I wrote it across probably about 20 years. I think the oldest story in here is from 2007, so 15 to 20 years. And the most recent one was published in 2021. So it's an accumulation of many years of work. And I think in some ways the stories reflect that they are about lots of different subjects that, became my obsessions at different times in my life, across many different situations where I was living. I was in school in St. Louis, I was in school in Salt Lake, getting different jobs. And then, but what's really interesting about it is to see, for me, the ways that my fixations stayed sort of consistent or became clear to me over the patterns of writing. So while I'm still sort of discovering what those patterns are and talking about a book, you're often surprised that people notice things that, you didn't notice yourself. So for me now, things that I'm noticing, I mean, a lot of it is historical fiction. And there's a consistent sort of fixation on the body, whether it's the ways that we read the body through different systems or have tried to read and understand the body through different systems in the past. So, for example, phrenology or iridology, things that we call pseudoscience now, but may have at certain times been considered scientific ideas, or more contemporary understandings of the body, of looking at our own body. And not all of them are about that, but this sort of blending of history, art, science, and just sort of the mysteries of our attempts to understand what it means to be human, especially through the body. I think those are the sorts of patterns that have come up for me. And then I have an interest in formal experiment, which I'll talk about in some of the later questions, but I'm very interested in how we tell the stories in addition to what they're about. And I think that that's pretty clear across the collection. So always trying to find an interesting way to shape the narrative.
I love that, and paying attention to what, what interests you. And one of the best pieces of writerly advice I had heard once from Anne Napolitano was pay attention to those things that are the magnets that, stick to your, inner magnetic board. If you keep coming back to them, that means, you probably want to write about them. Okay, Jolene, tell us about SIDLE Creek.
Okay, well, I echo exactly what Shena had said. Thank you so much, Julie, for doing this. And I am so happy I was able to get a chance to read, Shena's work and see some of her readings online as well. And it's just amazing. You guys, if you haven't gotten a copy, you got to order one right now, because it will blow your mind apart. Those 13 stories are just amazing. So my collection, similarly, and I worked on it, over the last 15 or so years. Some of you are here and you would have seen earlier versions of it. I was working on it mostly at the time when I was being a caregiver for my dad, who had had a massive stroke in 2007. And at the same time, my son was starting kindergarten. And so I found myself truly in that sandwich generation of taking care of two groups at one time. And since they were both, one was an older man getting ready to kind of move on to another chapter of his life, which was, he had a lot of debilitating situations, a lot of deficits. And my son was growing into a young man and becoming, a different kind of, like, his life was in a different kind of transition as well. So it really set me up for taking a really close look at men in our culture, and especially in a rural culture. I started looking closely at, are they allowed to cry? Are they allowed to be angry? How are they allowed to be angry? What does that look like? And what does it mean when you need help if you're a man? Because there are a lot of stereotypes and caricatures around people who come from rural areas as well as urban and suburban areas. But I was noticing mostly in my area how that looked, and how my son was, sort of navigating this, and how my dad was navigating this. So my dad was this little 5'7" Sicilian man with a really deep baritone voice. And he was kind of scary to some people, including me sometimes. So he was this big character, and I was trying to sort of figure him out. So you'll see in my collection, there are a lot of stories about parents and children. Some of the scarier, darker stories, people have asked me, is that your dad? And there are parts of him that are in it, but he's not nearly as scary as the men in my book. But the tender men in my book, I found a lot out about my dad as I took care of him when he was really getting to the end of his life, that these tender moments were incredible. So I tried to capture those as well in my stories. And then, of course, as you know, as you're looking into other people, you start looking into yourself. So I was looking also at how women were treated in our area and what kinds of things we dealt with. The same time, all of these stories were coming together. At the end of it, we were dealing with the pandemic and the early lockdown days. And we were reading through, my agent and I were reading through the collection, and we both agreed that a lot of the stories were really dark and heavy. And I had other stories that we didn't include in the collection that were much lighter and more dynamic in different ways. And we thought it would be neat to kind of balance that out. So one of the last stories I wrote is called You Four Are the One. And it's about neighboring, because during the pandemic, I got to see, I always knew my neighbors were really important to me, but I got to see just how important, especially the very close neighbors were, because we were relying on each other every day for figuring out how to get through this, whatever it was. And then we were looking at ways that the pandemic affected people in different areas. So in urban areas and suburban areas and rural areas as well. So that allowed me to write a little bit about medical conditions and things that sometimes are different for people in different areas. So the book is 22 short stories. Some are flash, some are quite long. The longest one I think is like 11,000 words. It's a crime story called Those Red Boots. And I wrote them similarly, as Shena was saying, over about, like I said, 15 or so years. But I have to do a shout out to Dave Joss here, because he worked with me on my collection, and it wouldn't be the collection it is if he wouldn't have helped me so much. I worked for a year with him through the VCFA program, where I met Julie, and we were both in a class together. And thank you to Kevin Morgan Watson too, because two of the stories that are in the collection, Shell and Steer, he published in Prime Number magazine. So I can't thank you both enough for that.
And you see, I had the link to David's book ready in Prime, but I just put in the chat. Which maybe we'll get to a later question about how you structured the collections. But this book really helped me, and I know helped Jolene.
Yes.
So I highly recommend getting a copy of Alone with All That Could Happen. Okay, let's go to my first question, which is, let's start with the title of this session, Bold Stories. Tell us about a bold choice you made in one or more of your stories. How did you make it? What were you worried about the choice? And if you know, how have readers reacted? Jolene, why don't you start?
So yeah, I in a lot of my stories, I decided that I would include jargon of working class jobs, or specific jargon of specific hobbies, because I felt that sometimes it can distance the reader, but sometimes it can have the reader look up a word and fall into a rabbit hole of figuring out, wow, what does this mean? And it can lead them to something really interesting. So one of the stories that I started out with some heavy jargon. It's called The Less Said, and it's about a time, I take it from a time when I was really small, where my dad took me to visit a man who did reloads of shotgun shells in his basement workshop. And I'll never forget that space. It was haunting, scary, interesting, everything you can imagine. The way the man talked about his work in dealing with ammunition was just so technical and fascinating. And when I would hear this guy talk in other kinds of situations, they were just BS and, they were whatever. But when he talked about this, he sort of came alive. And so I wanted to do that in one of my stories. And so I did it at the beginning of The Less Said, which I think was kind of a bold move, because if someone's not interested in that, they can flip the page and turn away and decide not to read. So I liked that I could start out that way. I did a similar thing with one called Seed to Fool, which is in the language of a sawyer's voice, who's talking just about wood. And it ends up that it's a story about the death of a baby, but it begins as almost like a technical guide to how to cut wood.
Oh, do I have to ask you to unmute again? Yeah. Okay.
I loved that use of language in your stories, Jolene, and not being from that part of the country. It felt that was part of how the characters came to life for me. So it was definitely something I noticed. I love that.
Oh, thank you.
In mine, I feel like I could probably answer this question for most of the stories in the book, because it feels like no matter what story a writer is writing, I think this is true for all writers, there's always some risk that you're taking. And maybe the reader won't identify that as a risk, but that it was something new and felt risky. I'm going to talk about one story called Benevolence, which is one of the older stories in here. And I feel like it for me took risks in both the form and the content. The content, because it's a historical story about a figure, an actual historical person, Eliza Farnham, who was the first matron of the women's wing of Sing Sing prison in the 1840s. And what interested me about her is that she practiced phrenology. So she had these progressive ideas about the possibility of prisoners being able to grow and change, about, reform, that people were not just inherently bad, but that they could actually learn and change themselves and change their lives, which seems like at the time it was quite a progressive idea. And yet the way that she practiced this was through phrenology, which history has, of course, proven to be not at all progressive, but quite racist, and leads us to eugenics and extermination of groups of people. But her idea was that if you could understand a person's head shapes, you could understand the person, and you could actually change your personality by, oh, well, you have a proclivity for greed. If you address that, you could change it. You were born with it, but it's changeable. So sort of this combination of something progressive and something that now we can see is like absolutely leads to violence and horror. But she was, in my story, sort of pitted against the prison chaplain. So there's a sort of idea of science against religion. Both systems kind of fall apart for the characters in the end. Like, I don't think that's really a spoiler. So that was sort of the content risk for me, was writing about these ideas that felt murky and sort of difficult to wrangle for me as a writer. And then formally, I incorporated a contemporary voice, this sort of disembodied poetic sections from the narrator is how I see it, but it's not identified who this voice is. But it's a much more like poetic voice that interjects in the story. And for me, that kind of gave room for this sort of gentle contemporary consciousness to kind of intercede in the historical story. But they're sort of strange little lyrical bursts that come from nowhere that were really fun to write. And that was the first story that I wrote that way. So it was a big kind of voice and form risk for me at the time. And I think I've like borrowed from myself in different ways in other stories since then.
That's great. That's great. Okay, I'll give a follow-up question to the bold stories questions. I think it was Shena in your acknowledgements, you thanked one of your teachers for provoking wildness in your writing. So can you explain that, and what advice do both of you have for other writers to provoke wildness?
Like I said, I think I think my younger self thought there's like conventional narrative and then there's experimental narrative. And somewhere along the way, somebody said to me like, well, like people consider Alice Munro's stories to be conventional narrative, but they are not. They're absolutely wild, like pulling in letters and flashing back and forward through time, but they still read as if they're fairly conventional until you pause to think about it. So maybe the first teacher that introduced that idea of wildness to me was just thinking that every narrative has a certain kind of wildness, but some we notice more than others. At WashU in St. Louis, where I got my MFA, I think most of my classmates were writing fairly conventional narratives, but our professors were writing fabulism and odd sort of supernatural narratives, like lots of really wild, interesting stuff. And then when I was at the University of Utah, my professors there were very much about how you tell the story in interesting ways. And I think about that for me is like, every story has kind of been told in some way. There's nothing new under the sun, et cetera, et cetera. But what's new is how we tell the story. So it could be the most familiar narrative with the most familiar narrative patterns, but if you tell it in a new way, it becomes exciting. And that's true for me as a writer. So I guess at the University of Utah, I was encouraged. My formally experimental, formally wild side was encouraged by my professors there, who were quite interested in, one of them in wild lyrical voices and another in just playful, inventive forms. So that's where the wildness comes from. And those professors are Melanie Ray Tone for the lyrical wild voices and Lance Olson for the formal experiment.
Jolene,
So
you
for
have
me,
any?
I
Yeah, go
guess,
ahead.
yeah, that's what I was just gonna say. For me, I guess I had the opposite kind of problem sometimes. I tend to veer toward melodrama. And so, or melodramatic subjects. And so for me to take on subjects that are about grief or about maybe drugs addiction or are about PTSD, I had to figure out ways to do it that didn't seem like it was the same story told again and again. So one of the stories for me had to do with fetal abductions, which could be a really melodramatic situation. And because when I had my son, I had an emergency C-section, and it was a very emergent situation. I wanted to find ways to write about this topic of fetal abduction because it was in the news. There were about 9 cases of it that happened between the time I had my son in 2000 and about 2009 when I started writing the story. The problem was that I couldn't write it as straight narrative. It just wasn't going to work. There were so many complications and problems that came up, and I was frustrated with it, to be honest. And so I started thinking one day about how with PTSD, time is so fluid and can be manipulative to your mind. When you're dealing with trauma, the triggers come at any time. So you're all at once living in the present, past, and the future all at once sometimes, because you're predicting what problems may come to you in the future. You're fixated on the past and you're triggered by it. And then you have to live in the present, which can be really scary. So I started writing the story. It's called The Steep Side, about a fetal abduction. And well, actually, I pulled from about, like I said, the 9 different ones that had happened. And I wrote this story in multiple tenses. So I would have a section in future tense, section in present, section in past, and I kept sort of, going through those again and again. And it's told out of order as well, because I just think that form spoke to what happens to people who really do suffer with PTSD and how disorienting it can be. That was one that I did. And then another one that I really wanted to capture this horrific idea I had in my mind about what could happen in a rural area if people from the city came and were harming people in the middle of the woods. That's a cliche, right? It's even Deliverance, okay, only the opposite, right? So I wanted to write the story. I knew I wanted to write it. Every time I sat down to write, I thought, this is just ridiculous, So I thought, I'm going to write it like the rumor mill works. I'll write one person's point of view, something they found, and then I'll write from another person's point of view, and then I'll write plural first person, because that's how, well, we didn't know what happened, that kind of deal. So I was trying to play with point of view, and I think there are 12 different sections. So it sort of comes together. There are lots of gaps. But I think too, what helps me sometimes when I'm dealing with a really tough subject is, as in the Seed to Full story, where there's a baby that dies and it's a stillborn birth. But I wanted to come at that story not from the perspective of the mom, not from the perspective even from the dad as a father, but the dad as the person who's making the casket, because he's a woodworker. So I think I tried to come at things at the angle that was unexpected, and it really felt fulfilling in that way, because I didn't feel like I was telling the same story again and again. But the final one that when Shena was talking about form, I think sometimes with writers, we can get like, I'll speak for myself. I can get bored with myself because I keep telling the same story again and again. But sometimes I'll start playing with form to just see how long one sentence can be. So I have one piece called The List, and I think the first sentence is 117 words. And the reason I wrote that one was because it was in a class with Kathy Fish where she had us write a rant. And so a rant really lends itself to writing a long, convoluted sentence. But also David Foster Wallace had written a story I would teach every year called Incarnations of Burned Children. And I think that whole story is over 1,000 words easily, maybe close to 2,000, but I think there are only like 7 sentences. And so I really think that sometimes as writers, it's good for us to sort of play with that thing we love the most, which is language or syntax or diction or sentence length or sentence style. And it can keep us excited about what we're doing. Another thing I did in that story, The List, is I used digraphs, like a lot of, I think I have, there are dozens of words that are double letter words. It's just my fun thing to do for me, and nobody really notices it, but I like that I did it. So I think that's important to do, just kind of have fun with your writing. And especially when you are writing about tough subjects, because I don't think there's anything wrong with continuing to write about the toughest subjects that are out there. But I think when we write them in the same way over and over again, it almost becomes white noise and it's not good, So that's what I tried to do, steering away from melodrama, but I'm still there all the time.
Well, I'd like to ask each of you to read a short section from one of your stories now, based on the previous questions we've just been discussing. Who wants to go first?
I can go. I'll
Okay,
read the
go ahead.
beginning of the Less Said, since I talked about that one. That's the rumor mill one. And I also talked about it with the diction thing. So it's called The Less Said, and it shows up about the middle of the book. It was a simple pulley, not weathered, maybe fixed eye, with some plastic twine threaded through the sheave. It hung there from a bar, which had been bent in the middle by weight and poor planning. The bar was secured to 2 trees about 5 feet apart, wispy-looking quaking aspens, with trunks about as big around as an average female's thighs, smooth like them too. Other than that, and the hundreds of empty bullet casings scattered about and piled up in mounds, it looked like any other rundown ordinary camp. If they were true hunters, they would have recycled their casings instead of wasting them. These guys wouldn't take to sizing and primers. They wouldn't deburr, bell, chamfer. They wouldn't know what a carbide die was. True hunters would have had a proper gambrel hoist for the deer they hung. They were weekenders. That's if what they hung on that pulley was a whitetail. That's if that's what they crept into the woods to hunt.
Thank you. Dana, you have something?
Sure. I'll read a little bit from the beginning of Benevolence, which is the story I was talking about with the different systems of understanding and the voice shifts. I'm going to read 2.5 pages. As a child, Eliza Farnham had an unremarkable head. Round and smooth, it had the proverbial soft spot at the crown where her skull had last knit itself together. But by her 29th year, there had formed at the apex of her cranium a prominent bump. This bump was not particularly noticeable when one viewed Eliza directly, looking straight into her shadowy eyes. But when she turned to glance out at the bitter landscape or to reach for a book in some hidden corner of her office, it was suddenly evident, looking almost as if she had been recently clobbered and bruised. According to phrenology, the bump was located in region 13 of her skull, which housed the organ of benevolence, one in the conglomeration of organs that were her brain. Being her dominant organ, benevolence was swollen and pushed gently at the bone in which it was encased, resulting in the bump, outward evidence of Eliza's exaggerated goodwill. In 1844, Eliza's husband was off exploring the wilds of California. Not to be outdone by his pioneering spirit, she determined to put her powerful organ to use in the new women's wing at a prison on the banks of the Hudson River. 30 miles north of New York, and 20 years before Eliza's arrival, 100 prisoners had quarried river rock and built the walls that would contain them. Through 3 frozen winters, they worked, and when they finished, it was Sing Sing, place of stone. Eliza spent her first morning as prison matron sitting at a table in the corner of the mess hall, watching her charges and taking notes. In her notebook, she drew the outlines of several skull shapes, simple busts, including profiles. Beneath each sketch, she wrote the corresponding prisoner's name, which was provided for her by the chaplain, John Lucky, who already detested her. Beneath the name, she jotted speculations about the prisoners according to the shapes of their skulls. Acquisitiveness, she wrote beneath one sketch, and she turned to the chaplain to inquire about this woman's crime. Larceny, he answered, and Eliza smiled in triumph. As the prisoners settled for lunch, a straggler arrived, a guard close behind pressing a wooden club between her shoulder blades. The prisoner was young and strikingly attractive, with black hair and pale skin. Her eyes were steely. Upon entering the room, she cast them to the floor. She had a small head perched delicately upon a slender neck and narrow shoulders. Her arms hung like plumb lines. Eliza stared, making no notes, sketching nothing. But when the chaplain declared, Sorry, I've lost my spot. When the chaplain cleared his throat and stood to lead the prisoners in prayer, she rapidly sketched the girl's profile. The shape of her skull was apparent through her sleek hair, which was pulled into a tight plait that ran down her back like an external spine. In her sketch, Eliza captured, if not exaggerated, the prisoner's short forehead and the plateau, a divot even, on the front half of the top of her head. Behind that was a pronounced but dainty rise in the same place as Eliza's own most prominent bump. Eliza jotted pronounced benevolence, and beneath that, deficiency of justice and self-esteem. The prisoner's name, Eliza learned when the chaplain finished his prayer, was Maria Jati. Her crime was murder. Yellow bile, black bile, blood, and phlegm, each courses in symphony through the veins. The trick to health lies in balancing the four. Here, a bilious woman, her temperament evident in her swarthy skin and close-set eyes, not to mention she refuses to peel potatoes. She spits in the dishwater. A spoonful of tartar emetic will thin her yellow bile. And this one's a melancholic. Thin hair, high temples. She has a quick mind, but see how she slumps. She chatters her teeth, practically brimming with black bile. Rub her skin with mustard, blister her arms, dose her with calomel, a miracle in a teaspoon. The sanguine, face full and ruddy, paces her cell and sighs, too much blood rushing through her veins. Leeches should do the trick. And the phlegmatic is soft and round, with jowls and a bulbous nose. For this underwater mover snuffling in her sleep, a handful of prickly ash steeped in tea will quicken her. So I wanted to read to that point because that's the first shift into the other voice.
Excellent. Thank you both. Okay, my next question. We often speak about place in fiction, and Jolene, Sidle Creek, it's very clear where the place is that you're talking about, Western Pennsylvania. But in Shena's stories, as you mentioned in your intro, they take place in a lot of locations. And to me, the place in We Are a Teeming Wilderness is definitely the human body. Can you each speak a little bit about how you approach place or the discoveries your characters make about the places they inhabit?
Well, for me, I can say that it was interesting to write in points of view that were not from my area. So there was one character, Hubert, who is dealing with he's grieving the death of his wife. He's a mathematician who's won the Fields Medal. He is into, geometry and Fibonacci sequence and things like that. So he's afraid of the woods. And I was going to read just a short little piece of that to show how this outsider is looking at the woods. It's just very brief. Hubert and Genevieve moved to her family land in rural Western Pennsylvania, 40 miles north of Pittsburgh, almost 3 years before. Far, both mentally and physically, from their former university positions, it was a secluded 9-acre lot, isolated from everything domestic and human, filled with everything feral, wild. The cabin itself was a small salt box built by Genevieve's great-grandfather, and they both agreed, Hubert somewhat reticently and she most insistently, that they lived there once they both retired. Can't let it sit empty any longer, Hugh, she had said year after year when he kept putting off the move. My math is in the city, was his mantra, to which Genevieve would counter, math is everywhere. It will be in the woods too. You'll see. Then a little later in the narrative, he's very, very distraught trying to deal with his grief. So he finally goes out into beyond the manicured part of the lawn and gets into the woods. And so when his hands would reach for her in those weeks after everyone had long walked away from him, standing, staring at her casket, those living wives of his friends sinking hills into sod, navigated by their husbands to cars, to closed doors, to car engines starting and gravel popping. In those days when he needed just to feel her slender wrists, he would wander through the woods, tripping over brambles, kicking through brush. He needed to touch something growing. What did he care if he stepped into some hole that would sink him? What did he need to do to feel again? Then one morning in late spring's business of green and growth, Hubert started to count things. It helped. That day he counted 15 hemlocks on the east side of the lot, 7 hickories, He used Genevieve's tree identification booklet, flipping pages, considering bark, edges of leaves, alternate and opposite branching, and he choked up when he saw her annotations in the back. Her handwriting making her somehow present again. He scratched out the words, immediately regretting it, collapsing at the base of an oak and crying. In those days, anything could upend him. A stray cat's fur left behind on the porch cushions, a mud wasp whining, a bird splashing in a puddle after a rainstorm. All things Genevieve would have pointed out had she still been with him. However, in counting, he seemed to find center. So for weeks, he continued to count random things to pilot his days, ratios of pine squirrels to gray squirrels, ashes to oaks, cirrus vibratus to cirrus duplicatus, lobed leaves to spiked. It wasn't that he was trying to order things exactly. It wasn't that he didn't understand the randomness of her death. Perhaps he understood far too well the patterns that randomness offered. He counted finite things, mayapple plants one day, thistles the next, but he became exhausted when the number reached triple digits and perplexed by his own counting grid. So for me, it was easy to write from my perspective, from a person who had grown up in this area, but it was a little harder to look at it with fresh eyes. It was the best thing to do, though, because I got to I got to see everything so beautiful again. I mean, it was this amazing thing that I had never really considered. You know, how would someone from a place that had never been in nature regularly, how would that assault sort of hit them, and then maybe become something that actually was no longer an assault, but actually something that could help them heal and be resilient. So that's how it happened for me. But place was fun. It was really fun to look at in both of those ways, I think.
Love that. I love that. Okay, Shena.
In that story that Jolene was just reading from, which I really love that one, I think your sort of exercise and like seeing the place fresh, somehow like your knowledge of that place and those plants, letting him discover it, like it puts me in that position of getting to discover it as also sort of an outsider to the place, and knowing those names and the cataloging of it. I felt like that intimacy with him and that discovery of wonder in that place. I loved that. In response to Julie's question, Julie, I love that you noted in your question that you feel like the place in mine is mostly the human body. And I do care a lot about place in my writing, but I don't have, as Jolene does, like one place where I think in Jolene's stories, we get like the portrait of a place through its people and their attachment to the place and their different relationships with it. And mine are all over the country. And I think that that's possibly like a reflection of me too, that I have moved a lot. And I love the land a lot. I like being out in nature. But it's always different places and getting to know different places. So I was thinking about, what is that? Like, what is a setting or a place, and how can the body be a setting or a place that we know and that we map? And even just in the section that Jolene was reading, that moment with the handwriting and the way that handwriting is the trace of a body's physical presence in that space. I'm really just interested in the ways that our bodies inhabit spaces and places, and when the body is not there, there's sometimes traces left behind, like handwriting. And I think that one of the fixations in my stories is sort of this charting, this mapping of the body in the same way that we map landscapes. And sometimes that's quite literal, and like charting parts of the skull or parts of the eye. There's one story which I'll hold up. It has a diagram of a body, and that's the starting point, as a character uses that diagram to sort of map an experience he's had being mugged, and sort of what is that sort of distancing yourself from your own home, which is your body, like the place that goes everywhere with you. And it is you. So yeah, I guess I'm thinking about the body as a landscape that is always changing, but the only one that we can be truly knowledgeable of, but it's full of mysteries and it's always changing. And every time we think we know it, something changes in our body and it's not the same anymore. So yeah, that's just a long way to say, like, thanks, Julie, for noticing that the place that is consistent throughout the story is the body.
And that's why your title is so apt. We are a team in wilderness, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, so that leads me to another question, which is, tell me about an aha moment that you had, or a magical moment where you heard about something or you had an idea and you were like, oh, I must write about this. This is, like a light bulb going on in your head or whatever, like that you knew that this is a subject you must write about.
I guess I'll go first. Do you want to go first? Is that okay? Okay.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah,
So,
great.
so for me, this was a tough question. As I said to Julie before we got on, I had so many aha moments, and because I usually work from different forms of art to use them as prompts. So one of my stories was like from, Dvorak's Ninth Symphony. There are ones that come from like, Handyman, James Taylor's Handyman, so they're from songs, but they can also be from art. And one thing that happened to me, I was in a studio and I saw pictures of the shells of red-winged blackbirds. And I'll bring this story up because this is one of the ones that Kevin Morgan Watson had published in Prime Number magazine called Shell. And I was at a show for a photographer, Rosamond Purcell, who takes photographs of nests and eggs. She takes photographs of all kinds of things, but in this particular show, she was cataloging eggs and nests. And I saw this one photograph that was a repeat of multiple eggs from red-winged blackbirds that have little tiny squiggles on them. And I immediately started thinking that it looked like those were fortunes someone might read. I looked it up all over to see if anyone reads eggshells. The best I could get was that there are people that predict futures from breaking an egg open and reading the yolk, but I don't think it exists that people can do this, which some people that read the story are convinced that this happens and that I didn't make it up, that it really is happening, but I made it up. And so I started writing the stories about this man who has post-traumatic stress disorder, and the way that he orders his life is he tries to read futures, and his wife, who's from Vietnam, can also read futures. So that was a really big aha moment for me. And I think that that's one of the ways that nature can kind of like connect with us as human beings. If we look closely enough, we can see these wild signs, that sometimes someone else might not notice. I think people that are reading and using divination in that way, looking at corn tassels and cracks in sidewalks, are fascinating people because they're really taking a close look, looking through a different kind of lens, this micro kind of looking. I had this wonderful book that shows what teardrops look like when you put a microscope so closely on them, and they can actually tell if they were tears from grief or tears from happiness. That just blows me away. So this story, I had a huge aha moment, but I did do one thing. I wanted to show you guys something. So in memory of today, I made red-winged blackbird eggs and they say our titles of our books and our names on them to give to you guys for doing this event, because I'm fascinated by all the people that are asking me if that story is true. And now I want to find red-winged blackbird eggs and start reading futures. So maybe I'll start doing that.
Yeah. Nobody does it yet.
That's right. That's right.
Man, that's fantastic. That seems like something one of my characters would do too, that I would attach to that idea of like, how can you tell these futures from egg yolks? That would be a system. I like this question too. And it was like a question for me of like, which one should I talk about? Because the ones that make it, a story that makes it to the end is the one that thing really grabs you firmly, but I don't always know at the beginning which one it's going to be. Like sometimes the aha comes pretty far into the game. And so I guess I'll talk about that one because Jolene brought this story up earlier before we started the official call. The Other Matter, which is a retelling of a scene in the Odyssey, the moment when Odysseus returns, and he doesn't identify himself to his father, who has been missing him for 20 years. And doesn't recognize him because he's grown so much and his father is old and maybe his vision is compromised. But he doesn't recognize himself, and Odysseus does not. He doesn't recognize his son, and Odysseus does not reveal, I'm your son. I've returned for a while in that encounter. So how did I come to write this? Where did the aha moment come for me? And like, I want to rewrite this scene, and it was sort of a weird circuitous path. in which I was working on a novel that I'm still working on. And I thought it was going to be set in Gloversville, or a town like Gloversville, New York, which is near me and where they used to make gloves. And so and then I thought, you know what, I'm doing all this research into gloves and glove making for this novel. I'm going to write an essay about gloves. So I started working on this essay about gloves, which my essay mode is very segmented and collagey. So I was like looking for famous stories about gloves to include in my essay. And I found that the first reference to gloves in literature, or one of the first references, is in the Odyssey. And it's in this moment when Odysseus returns and his father Laertes is out working in his garden, and there's a mention to the gloves he's wearing to protect his hands from the thorns. And so I was just fascinated by that, and then, revisiting the scene in the Odyssey. And then I ended up writing an entire story about that encounter. And I've never written the essay, and I don't even think I'm going to include that information in the novel I'm working on anymore. So it was like a weird, maybe this is the anti-aha moment, in which I was like, oh, now I've written 10 pages about this scene. I guess this is the aha happens after I've gone too far into it to turn around. And the story ends up being also a story about immigration and who is allowed to be in the US. It's a contemporary retelling, so it's set on a contemporary farm. Yeah.
Yeah, before we get on, I love that story so much. I just have to say, I was so upset that I'm not currently teaching the Odyssey, because I'm not teaching right now. I teach it every year, and I wish I would have had that story to teach alongside it. It is incredible, beautiful. I can't say enough. It's just amazing.
I agree with you that the aha moment sometimes comes later in the process, and sometimes the aha moment is like, how am I going to end this story, or what's the right scene to end it. So I want to leave enough time for questions from the audience. So please start putting your questions in the chat. I have another like dozen questions I could ask, but I'll just ask one more while you're all thinking of your questions, which is, tell us how did you decide to structure your collections? Shena, why don't you start?
How did I decide to structure it? Because I mentioned at the beginning of this that this collection grew over 15 or more years, and so there were times when it was structured differently, and there were other stories in here as I was trying to sort of decide if I had a collection. I would try this story and see which themes emerged, and then take a story out, and I would write a new one, add a new one in. So it was a pretty organic and slow method of structuring it. And in the end, like this arrangement, this is the arrangement of stories now is the arrangement it was when I submitted it to Press 53. And how I decided on that ordering was partly about, the ways the stories speak to each other, of wanting to put ones next to each other that maybe had a thread connecting them, or perhaps the rhythms of it, starting with one that's sort of long and historical, and then the next one being more contemporary, medium length, and then throwing in a flash, separating the flash pieces. So thinking about rhythm, thinking about the ways two stories next to each other would create a conversation with each other, and yet not wanting ones to be next to each other that were too similar. So separating ones that felt very similar. That was mostly, it's like arranging a playlist to me. How did you think about it, Jolene?
So it's weird you say arranging a playlist. I wrote an essay for Writer's Digest about how I used some music background. I was in a band, and so we had to do a set list. And so I thought about, what we had to decide when we were trying to figure out which songs should follow one another. What I did is I took the beginnings of each story and put them on cards, and the endings, and I would read them and see, sort of how one would flow into another, because I knew what the stories were about. So I knew which tone was going to kind of, merge with the next one. But one of the things that helped me so much, huge shout out to David Joss, his book, Alone with All That Could Happen, and especially the essay, and I think it's still called that in the new version of the revised version of the book, Stacking Stones. That helped me so much because I was able to go through and use my sort of literary analysis, literary theory background and pick out recurring motifs or liaisons and figure out how, because I had several stories in the book that had to do with pregnancies or loss. And I didn't want them to be next to one another. And it's funny you mentioned that, Shena, how the tone and how you're kind of carrying your reader through. Since I was dealing with some heavy material, I had to be very careful that I didn't have two next to each other that were deeply troubling. So I would do a little bit of relief, I think, or I tried to do a little relief. But for me, it was a matter of just kind of like thinking about it as an album, like as like a great album, like, the Eagles Hotel California or something, that we can remember how those songs, we can remember which song followed another. And unfortunately, people who are listening now, they don't have that same, they have Spotify lists, but they don't have that same kind of concept album thing that I grew up with. So I could use that. So I put the book in the chat. And if you're interested in putting your collection together, use Dave's advice. It's wonderful.
Which is the answer I always give also when I get asked that about my book. And I'll just add to that, and the balancing, like it was actually Ellen Lesser from BCFA who helped me figure out, think of your book in like a play, act 1, act 2, act 3, and you need to balance in each act stories of different, for my book, it was different points of view and different ages of my main character. And I used that advice from Ellen and David's essay, Stacking Stones, about, finding the thread. So that's always the answer I give. So great. Okay, any other questions from the audience? I'll just keep going with mine.
One more thing I wanted to say, Julie, too, is trying to decide for the first story of your collection, because that was something I struggled with. I don't think that, like, as a writer, I was able to figure out which one would catch people or be that hook that it needed to be. But I did have advice from Barbara Jones, who at the time was a senior editor at Henry Holt. I had worked with her at Tinker Mountain, and she had said, you just sort of show your hand. Like if you have a beginning, you don't want the reader to feel like they don't know what's coming. That was her sort of point of view, at least, that, my story that starts the collection is the title story. But the reason it is the first story is because in that story, I have a little bit of a speculative fiction bent. So people will know that might come later. I have violent acts. They'll know that will come later. I have nature motifs that will come later. So sometimes the best story can be one that sort of checks all the boxes of what the whole collection will be. So I just wanted to add that, because that really helped me. I couldn't decide. Everyone would say, put your best story first. Well, I'm not a great judge of what my best story is. In fact, I would be like, okay, I'm not putting any story up there because I don't think any of them are great.
Okay, we have a question from Jennifer, and I want to give a shout out to Jennifer, who's the person first brought Jolene and I together in our online writing group, the Quills, which doesn't really exist anymore, but thank you, Jennifer. And she asks, are there any stories you felt strongly about that you didn't include, and why, and do you feel differently now?
That's a great question. For me, I think that there were stories that at some point I had included when they were newer to me that eventually got shuffled out. And why did I shuffle them out? Sometimes it was because they just didn't feel like they fit the themes or the ideas anymore as it became more and more body focused. And do I regret or think differently about taking some of them out? I don't. I feel like it took a long time for me to find the right ones to put together. And just because the stories that didn't make it into this collection aren't in this collection, they still have their own life. Maybe they'll be in some future piece. And I think at the moment, I feel like the ones that I haven't included, I probably don't feel excited enough about to have put them in here. So I feel like I took out the ones that I felt like maybe my writing or my thinking about narrative had evolved beyond it. The voice didn't feel like mine anymore. But you know, who knows over time what happens.
For me, there were a couple that we pulled out and swapped in for other ones. And one in particular is really, really creepy story that I absolutely love, but honestly, it's more like literary horror. And it didn't feel like it fit the collection as well. And then I did a lot of revisions on it and changed the point of view, the gender of the point of view. And I kept changing the story again and again. I was so excited about working on it and continuing to revise it that it just truly wasn't going to be ready in the form that I wanted it to be in by the time the collection needed to go out. But I'm going to be sending that one out there. And I think it is being sent out there right now. I think I sent it to a couple of places. But anyway, I think for me, the biggest thing that was interesting was trying to figure out, I had a lot of flashes that were serving a purpose of sort of building the world, the place. There were some that read much more like vignettes that didn't feel formed as well as stories, and they weren't standalone. And there's like probably one I regret not putting into the collection because it was really important to me. And it was one of my first stories I had written, but I made the choice to not put it in. It wasn't anyone else telling me not to put it in. But I don't know, I think that it echoes for me when I read the book, and I've had other people mention some things in the stories that happen. And it's funny because they bring up the same theme that this story had. So I know it could have fit very easily in there. I think it's just always a work in progress, but I do have to say, like, my agent was really helpful in the story. The collection was going to be called Seeds, and it had been called Seeds for a long time. And she said that she felt that it should be called SIDLE Creek because it was so much about place. And that sort of changed how we were looking at which stories to include and which we weren't. So that was far on into the process. But yeah, there are a couple that I think could fit probably, but yeah, they're not in there.
Well, that kind of leads me to my next question, which is, will we see any of these characters in your future writing? And what are you working on now?
I don't think that you'll see any of the characters from my stories in my future writing. They feel pretty contained as they are. What I'm working on now, I like to cheat on my bigger projects. So, if I sort of stall out, I write a story or an essay. But I'm working on a novel now that is set in central New York, so not far from where I live, in a kind of post-industrial city. It's historical, and it has a lot of sort of medical stuff and exploration of the body in it. So I think some of the themes and my interests in like form and also place, natural world and how we live in it are very much present, but not the characters. Characters are all new. And it is also, it begins with the retelling of a Greek myth. So maybe there's some overlap there too. I like those kinds of contemporary retellings of familiar stories.
Yeah, so the novel that I had been working on in the last year, there are a couple characters that are in the collection that I just can't not write them still. They're still kind of in there. And I gave them much bigger roles. So I'm very excited about that. And then I have another novel project that I started, and lo and behold, they showed up again. So they're in there as well. But I don't know, for me, even writing the collection was fun because in that way, with bringing up characters again, because I do have in a couple stories, I have this cheeser guy who is in one of the stories called The Less Said, but he shows up in another story called Eminent Domain. And sometimes I wouldn't name the characters. Like you might be able to figure out that they're coming up again. I love when that happens, that they sort of inhabit each other's stories, or they're sitting on the outside a little bit, looking in, or maybe someone is a character who would live next door to another character. And that's the way it would happen. I would be sitting in a class and I would start to write something, and I tell myself, I'm not going to write about this place. I'm not going to write about this place. And then all of a sudden someone's cousin popped in and I just had to write it. So that's happening with the novel projects as well.
It's fun. It's a lot of fun to see those characters repeat. Now I'm like, oh, there's Tiller Shanty again in another story.
Right?
He's the one who reads the shelf. So yeah, it's fun when that happens. Okay, let's see. One last question, unless other people from the audience want to ask. Do you have a favorite story? And if you'd like to do another little brief reading, it's up to you.
As far as a favorite goes, I feel like it changes for me, that it's not steady. It has been really nice hearing from readers about The Other Matter because it was one of the newer stories. And, I maybe had some insecurity about newer stories because some of the older ones had they've been published in a good place that sort of legitimized it for me. And then some of the newer ones, I felt like they weren't tested as much yet. So in a way, I like The Other Matter because it's the most recent story in the collection. And it's really nice to hear from readers about stuff that feels closer to me now. So I have a lot of affection for that story right now. I really like reading the title story, which is a short, and maybe I'll read from it after Jolene answers. And that one was just like, it's just a fun story for me. And I think it's funny. I don't consider myself a funny writer, so when I write a funny story, I'm like, ooh, I was funny.
So for me, I guess my favorite story probably is the title story, just because in that story, a girl, she's prepubescent. Well, she's having her first period. And I mentioned the diagnosis of endometriosis in it. And I love to bring medical terms into my stories because I was an X-ray tech and I lived in that world all the time with medical terminology. And I think the words they can be so beautiful and melodic, even when they're horrible things like carcinoma and endometriosis. But yeah, that was an important story to me because I was diagnosed with that. So it's not an autobiographical story necessarily, but I did want to take on some of those themes that we don't always see in stories and make it be something that might be interesting, not just to the women that would read it, but to men as well, because it's primarily about a single father who's trying to help his daughter deal with this and navigate this diagnosis that's tough to get diagnosis from. Takes up to 7 to 10 years for most people to have the diagnosis. So, and then there's a sort of a witch or medicine woman who actually makes the diagnosis. So it's a fun story for me, I guess. Yeah. And I'll probably read from that after Shena reads from hers. So.
Go ahead, Shane.
So this is a really short story, but since we've already been, talking at you all for quite a while, I'm still not going to read the whole thing. I think I'll just read the first page and a half. It starts with 2 quotes. So the story is, "We are a teeming wilderness." So the first 2 voices that I'm reading are not my own. "I can tell you the exact date that I began to think of myself in the first person plural. As a superorganism, that is, rather than a plain old individual human being. These several hundred microbial species with whom I share this body, which number around 100 trillion, are living and dying right now on the surface of my skin, on my tongue, and deep in the coils of my intestines." And that was Michael Pollan from an article called "Some of My Best Friends Are Germs." And do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. That's Walt Whitman. I'm Song of Myself. So I'm just going to read the beginning of this voice because I took Michael Pollan's quote as sort of like a narrative challenge. "We, the superorganism known as Glenn, often envision an infographic of ourself in the shape of a man. This infographic is a veritable stained glass window of colors and shapes. We imagine our mouth shape as red, esophagus yellow, sinuses green, gut purple, and stomach orange. Our brain is a quiet gray unless pulled out for close focus in an infographic of its own. Our groin is a fecund garden. Under a microscope, our groin would appear as a jungle full of tiny monkeys climbing on wiry trees. The ground cover absolutely crawling with life, blooming and dying and blooming. Sometimes we, Glenn, swap cells with other superorganisms. We've exchanged plenty of gypsy microbes with the superorganism that goes by Sophie. Sophie's a garden too, of course, a verdant Eden. Her infographic would be more purple than ours. Female superorganisms have longer intestines. And her jungle includes a tropical cavern. With Sophie, we cross-fertilize. We diversify our ecosystem. Some of us who are now Glenn used to live on or in Sophie. We traveled in caravans from Pink Cave to Red Cave, from Freckled Arm to Eyelash. Some of us have even returned to Sophie after a foray into Glenn. And the hardiest of us have traveled back to Glenn again. With Sophie, we have open borders. I'm going to stop there, which is, I don't know, a third of the way into the story.
Great, thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll read an excerpt from SIDLE Creek, and this is where the diagnosis comes. A year more had passed when Dad said, "I can't have you suffer," and went to crazy Miss Jean without me. She said it was a malady no one aspired to study for a long time. She said she had it too till she went through the change. She said people still think it's fake, a lie. She told him what kinds of stones to find at the SIDLE Creek, gave him a bottle of paregoric and told him to mix it with sugar. It tastes like black licorice gone bad, he said, and held the tiny whiskey glass to my lips. I forced myself to drink it. Warm, warmer, cramps eased, eyelids drooped, rest came until pain rippled again. Miss Jean told Dad to search for a keen doctor who will listen. She said it might take years. She gave the awful thing a name: endometriosis, 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 Dad said. I repeated it. It didn't sound half as mean as it was. Dad said, "It's a dirty, rotten shame." So that was the creek gives its cure, or hopefully it'll give its cure. And that was another thing that I wondered too about with place. I worried about, how much we all connect to the place we are, but how much we don't understand other places. So I was hoping that maybe with the book, people could not misunderstand, I guess, the rural areas that we live in, because that's important to me. I mean, especially now we have a hip camp that my son and I run, and we bring people from the city to come out to the rural area to kind of experience that kind of wonderfulness that there is. And we're so much more alike than we are different. And I'm hoping that even though the book is about one small place, maybe that it can resonate with lots of kinds of places.
I'm so glad you read that section, because I made a note of it also when I was reading the story, that here you have the single dad in the story. He's like, really into fishing, and there's so much tenderness in the men, a lot of the men in your stories, Jolene, and I can't have you suffer. And it's I was like, wow, that's it was like a prelude to some of the other men who are very tender towards their wives or their daughters or their sons. So I love that you read that. We have one more question from Zach, so let's answer his question. I'm really interested in the body landscape connection that came up earlier with Shena's work, especially because there's a lot of dialogue right now on fat phobia, objectification, non-cis bodies, and then a lot of confusion and tension around treating landscapes properly. Shena, are there any misunderstandings or cultural conflicts around the body you think a lot about, or that you hope to explore in future work?
Yeah, that is a very complex question. Thank you, Zach. I do think that the novel that I'm working on, because it is set in a post-industrial landscape, but a landscape that we now would mostly consider rural, a small town, central New York, River Valley. But a place where the land was not treated with care for a long time. The leather tanning industry was super toxic. And then the area also had a lot of carpet mills, and the dyes are incredibly toxic. And now some cleanup has been done in those areas, but this is the setting of the novel that I'm working on. So there's this legacy of sort of mistreating the land, and it's really difficult to prove things like high incidence of cancer are connected to the toxins in the watershed or in the soil, to prove that definitively. But there are high rates of especially cancers in that area, especially from maybe the 80s and the 90s before there had been any Superfund cleanup. So I guess your question sort of highlights what I'm actually really interested in, but the ways that our bodies and the landscape are so intimately connected to each other that we can't have healthy communities, we can't have healthy bodies if we don't have a healthy land to live in. And we have to take care of the land. It's a part of us or an extension of us. So while this is not really getting into the parts of your question, Zach, that are about fat phobia or non-cis bodies, it is very much about the connection between our care for each other and our care for communities, and how that keeps us healthy in all ways. One of the characters in the novel has been disabled because of a childhood cancer, and so there is some consideration of differently abled bodies. And then in the contemporary part, it's a novel that's partly historical and partly contemporary. In the contemporary part, there are characters who are sort of working on pulling those things together. Like, how can we use technology and especially textile work to sort of heal some of the wounds of the past? So it's still in very drafty phases, so I'm talking about it a little bit abstractly. But I like the question that you asked because it makes that connection about how we treat the landscape. And I think that's very much how we treat each other and how we treat our bodies and each other's bodies. And that those are really, really bound up concepts for me.
Thank you. Thanks.
I
That's
think
great.
also for Jolene. So.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Jolene.
I can't wait to read your novel. I feel the same way about so many of those issues that you bring up about the landscape, because I think that in some of these areas that are post-industrial, I know Idra Novi in her time out that she's talking now about her book, she talks about how she doesn't want Appalachia to become like an obituary, because sometimes we look at landscapes as though they're not living and thriving and changing, even when especially when there's been resource exploitation and whenever there's been great damage that's been done. And I think that one of the things that came up for me at one point when I was writing stories, I was writing constantly about people that had cancer. And I had a writing teacher who had said to me, enough with the cancer. Why are you always writing about people with cancer? That's not something people want to read about. And I was really upset by that, because in my area, because of the high power electricity lines, and I write about that in eminent domain, and because of fracking and the water table changing, we do have so many people who are suffering for different kinds of cancers that have never been explored before. There are no names for some of them. And so to just completely reject that kind of story writing, it rejects a certain place too. So I'm so thankful for the question. Yeah, these are ways that we can try to, there's not just a binary way of looking at anything. There's not just good water or bad water. There is water that's being, horrifically changed by industrial issues, but there's also water that's being amazingly treated by people who are environmentalists that are taking it on and doing amazing things with it. So we have to look at it in multiple ways and not just that sort of black and white. So thank you for the question. And I can't wait to read your book, Shena. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, definitely.
Probably be a while, but I hope someday.
Okay. So in the meantime, for those of you on the call that have not yet read, sorry, my fake background's blurring in and out. I want to encourage all of you to go out and get your copies of We Are Teeming Wilderness and SIDLE Creek. I'll send out an email tomorrow for those of you who missed part of this, with the full recording and links and things like that. And Kevin put some special offer in the chat, which I'll include also in the email tomorrow. I want to thank all of you for being with us today, and especially thank Shena and Jolene for sharing their words and their beautiful collections with us. I could stay on the call for another 2 hours talking to you and asking more questions, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you all so much for being here. I had a great time reading, doing this close reading. I was telling them before we all got on that I host a lot of these events, but most of the time I just let people talk, 15 minutes go, and I don't have to think of the questions ahead of time. So for me, this was a great educational opportunity to really look closely at your stories and try to think of questions and how I could learn from your writing. One of the questions, you kind of answered it, so I didn't ask it, but was tell us how did you do it? Like, what's the magic? But that's for all of us to kind of figure out, and from reading and loving your stories. So thank you all very much, and have a great day wherever you're tuning in from.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.